Our guest today is the wonderful Carol Nolan Drake. She's been the head of her own consulting firm, Carlow Consulting, for the past 4 years. Before that, for about a decade, she was the Chief External Affairs Officer, the Corporate Governance Manager for Ohio's Public Employees Retirement System, OPERS. So she wears that in-house investor hat. I'm Brock Romanek. So Carol's shareholder engagement during the proxy season this year, ESG issues, E&S issues are number 1 by far from what I've heard. So the first question I have for you is, how many of the stakeholders should companies engage with? Is it just shareholders for the proxy season, or is it broader than that? And then how many investors, how many shareholders, how many stakeholders do you drill down to? I guess it depends on your resources, but we'll see what you say.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, my advice to companies always is to look at the resources, to be dedicated, to the effort. And I understand too that a number of small and mid-cap companies, they may only have one person that's handling investor relations and other duties. So you have to scale it in a way that is important. One thing I will say is more conversations doesn't always mean better conversations, right? The quality of the engagement is what is most important. And I used to be awfully disappointed when I would hear a company say, well, we always talk to our top 100 investors, Carol. And I would say, well, I get that, but guess what? That doesn't include many institutional investors who own so many companies. They might not even own 1% of your company, but they are a powerful voice for that outreach. So you have to mix it up. You can't just go to your top investors over and over and over again and think that you have scratched the surface for a true engagement program. So I would say a mix of stakeholders, investors, and organizations that are, operating in and around the sector for that company, and even some nonprofit people in the community that would have an attitude or some sort of viewpoint about your company. These are all parts of what I would say would be an effective outreach program. I wouldn't get stuck on a number right away, because I think that makes you feel like you have a target and then you can just quit. Oh, I've talked to 50 investors, I must be done. Well, guess what? That 51st investor could have been the one investor that told you something that the other 50 did not mention that was a key component going into proxy season. And then after proxy season, speaking of proxy season, I think one priority, of course, you're going to go back and look at the votes cast by investors. There's an opportunity there for engagement after the proxy season. In fact, maybe it's a little better time frame to really have a discussion. And I always have suggested to IR officers, go ahead and look at the peers that are, compared to your company and see how they fared in their proxy season. What issues were on the share, what proposals were on the proxy, whether they were shareholder or management proposals, how the directors fared in their vote. That'll tell you a lot about the calls you might be getting in the future about your company, because that company already has been targeted. So pick up the phone and call them.
And what about the approach? Should there be tailored approaches for different investors, or should you use the same approach for different stakeholders?
Yeah, let me just say this. I know we're talking about resources, and that, is really, a challenge for that. But I would say that a cookie cutter approach and, PowerPoint presentation that you read through, in your 15-minute engagement call is really not very effective. And I would also suggest that, you don't have to have one tailored for every single investor, but you really should do some homework. Investors have particular issues in the E&S space, and it doesn't take too much time and effort to figure out what they want from that engagement call, right? So build that into the presentation. And if you don't know an answer, if you're not sure about the company's approach or what the board would do, it's absolutely right to say, I need to go back and I need to talk with them about that. I am not sure how this issue will play with the board, but I'm certainly willing in my role to take a look at it and, follow up with you. So that's really important. The other piece that I would say is that any more PowerPoint presentations, you can do that fairly easily on a Zoom call like this. And they can be even more in depth, I think. That doesn't mean more pages. I'm just talking about, having a real conversation without interruptions, unless, of course, the technology doesn't hold, something happens. You really have this focus in this virtual environment that you might not have had, in a flurry of like the old-fashioned phone calls where you didn't really get to see anyone. You didn't get to look at a screen, and share information. So it doesn't take, I think, too much effort to craft something that is personal to that particular investor. And I think that investor will appreciate it and feel, this really wasn't a waste of my time. I learned something here, and I can tell that they took advantage of an agenda and they didn't misuse the time with me.
Again. So during these pandemic times, companies are probably holding their ESG roadshows online. I'm sure they are in a virtual format. And perhaps having, now that people are comfortable being online, perhaps this is an opportunity to do an ESG roadshow if you haven't done one before. And so for those companies that are doing them, who should represent the company on the roadshow? Should there be a member of the board of directors involved? What capacities within the company, which officers?
Yeah, today's roadshows are vastly different because of, the impact of COVID-19. And I have found that roadshows in the virtual perspective are absolutely fine. And as I said, in some ways, they provide more opportunities for customized presentations. I mean, to your point, board members can pop in on an item on the agenda and then leave the call. You can have a CEO come in for a period of time. I think the point of, who in the company is the right person is the individual that's most associated with that ENS report or the program. Who's in charge of making sure that those metrics and milestones are actually advancing at the company. The CEO may be the most visible person or the chair of the board, but you know what? A lot of times those issues don't require that they be on a particular call or, part of a meeting. It, depends on the agenda. And in that virtual environment, you can invite them for a few minutes, as I said. I think the optimal structure is to find the individual, if it's an ENS officer, corporate secretary, general counsel, whomever, who has a strong, what I would say, a strong command of the company's ENS strategy, right? So someone who can speak to those finer points in it, has the gravitas in the organization to help speak for the company and perhaps the board. You don't want somebody who has to say all the time, well, I'm going to have to go back and check with my boss. I just don't know. Obviously I'm here just to entertain you for a while. You don't want that. And the ability to coordinate with the other C-suite officers and perhaps make a presentation to the board. So from an organizational perspective, it would be great if the person is equal or reporting to someone in the C-suite, but certainly someone who has an interest and is charged with, the ENS responsibilities. That's really the person who should be part of the roadshow.
And then when it comes to when's the best time to engage, you have the proxy season leading up to the annual shareholder meeting where you're trying to solicit votes. And these days, shareholders are very interested typically in your ENS issues, so you want to engage there. But then your ESG report might most likely comes out after after the shareholders meeting, and you might engage, I imagine, after the report comes out to find out what the feedback is from shareholders. What do you say about all that?
Well, I would say there's never a bad time to engage, but there are my kind of three things that are markers for me. One is when the company has something to say to investors, when the company has something to ask of investors, or has something to show investors. Don't have anything important to say. And investors are really busy during proxy season too, just like companies. So that may not be the perfect time to engage. However, I always tried to make time on my calendar, even during a busy proxy season. If a company representative had called me directly to say, Carol, I need to talk to you, I did everything I could to make time on that calendar because that meant this was urgent and this was important. And I probably was going to learn something I might not know or read from the research on the proxy or even the proxy statement myself. So the other thing is shortly after proxy season, and the good thing is there is time for an after the proxy season. I mean, we all feel, that each one kind of runs into the other one with all the international voting. But it's a good time for a company to reach out and follow up on some of those voting results, maybe for board members, or maybe your say on pay package got fewer votes than last time. Maybe there are concerns about proposals on the ballot. And if you're developing these relationships and you really want to continue those relationships, well, then you schedule time for that outreach. And particularly if a company has a new E&S policy or is putting out a report, you're seeking information on that, it's a really good practice to involve investors in that prior to the launch, or even before you're writing the next one. As I said, everyone likes to be involved and wants to provide some suggestions. Maybe there are some better models for reporting out there that you may not even be aware of. So the final thing that I would say is, if a company is seeking feedback and they've reached out to investor, by and large, investors are going to pick up that phone and schedule that time on the calendar.
You're such a fountain of wisdom. Any last thoughts?
Well, I have three kind of anecdotes that I should probably mention. The first one is really be mindful of the time. I used to tell my folks, there are only 24 hours in a day, and we all have those same 24 hours, right? No one expects us to work all the time on business, right? So we need to maximize that time effectively. And that means that in these engagement meetings and calls, you need to have the right people on the call, have a set agenda that you've shared in advance, right? You leave time for questions and discussion so that it really can be more of a listening opportunity for you too. I mean, no one wants to be part of a one-way messaging campaign. And I used to feel from companies, if all they were going to do is call me and go through their PowerPoint presentation, they could have sent that to me. And if they pack calls every 15 minutes and don't leave me any time to ask questions or have some kind of a discussion, then I'm not sure that was such a great call for me. So be mindful of time. And for me, I always said, if it was an issue for a board member, then I wanted to talk to a board member. But if it was more of a policy issue for the CEO or something coming in the financials with the CFO, I didn't have to talk to a board member. So I was mindful who needed to be on the call. The second one is follow-up. And I will tell you that this is so important, Brock. If a company representative said that she will send the final report when it's ready to the investor, well, then she needs to make sure she sends the report, right? If an investor asks to speak to a director or maybe the CEO during a call, then, and that investor, says, are you going to do that for me? Then you need to make sure that that conversation happens later on. Nothing burns bridges faster than people who make promises before proxy season to try and entice an investor to vote, and then they don't follow through. Now, it's the same for investors. If I say that I can't disclose my proxy votes until the day of the meeting, but I will call you afterwards and I will go through, the whatever degree I can share how we made the decision to either vote to withhold from directors or just support a director or support a shareholder proposal, then I need to put that on my calendar and make sure I follow up too. Those commitments are really important, and that's the way to build relationships, right? And the final thing is, don't let that relationship lapse. If you've spent all this time and effort to build up relationships with investors and you've called them before proxy season and you've reached out, it's not one and done, because no proxy season is the same than the other one. These issues continue to be brought up. And so if you have made that relationship, get out there, put together a call, put it on the calendar, and really foster that relationship. Some of the best conversations I used to have with people are the ones that I would say were kind of off the record. They didn't involve sharing, non-public, information. It was more of a, what's going on? How are you doing? I see the companies in the news. We're probably up nights working on the weekends, trying to go through all these issues. And it was always nice if somebody said to me, Carol, how are you doing? You're voting 12,000 proxies, in the short time frame. How are you keeping up with all that? That's how you develop friendships and relationships that last over time. And that really, isn't that what this is all about? I mean, investors are invested in these companies for a reason. We want them to succeed. And the people with whom we develop these relationships are really a key part in that success.
Yeah, I almost feel like if you ask that question, there's going to be tears, particularly during the pandemic. And just like, I can't take it.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
you need that release sometimes, and that's
right.
relationship when you feel.
That's what, and talk about authentic, right? And
Yeah.
if everything is always, the sun is shining, and it's sometimes you look at all these social media posts and you think, my goodness, these people never have a bad day. Well, that's not realistic, and that's not real.
Right now, every day is a bad day. It's
a good day.
Yeah. Well, look for the other vid guides that Carol's made. They're on ESG issues. They're fantastic. Thanks very much, Carol.
Thank you, Rob.